Mrs. Agatha Netherby's drawing room had once been the pride of Beaconsfield Avenue, its cornices crisp, its drapes impeccably laundered, and its mirror large enough to reflect not only herself but, she often felt, her moral superiority. By the spring of that particular year, however, time had intruded upon the house as rudely as it had upon its mistress. The plaster bowed faintly, the window sashes stuck, and even the clock, a solemn, walnut-cased heirloom, had begun to tick with a self-conscious limp. Mrs. Netherby was aware of these failings, but she believed that to acknowledge them too publicly would be vulgar. She preferred to let the house age as discreetly as her reputation. It was Elsie Moffat, the new housemaid, who first noticed that the drawing-room seemed to breathe. "It's not a draught, ma'am," she insisted that morning, her broad Yorkshire vowels colliding nervously with the heavy silence of the house. "It's breathing, like when someone's behind the curtain, quiet-like." Mrs. Netherby fixed her with a gaze accustomed to taming servants and postmen alike. "My dear girl, houses do not breathe. You are confusing your imagination with your employment." "Yes, ma'am." That would have been the end of it, had the portrait not moved. At luncheon, as Mrs. Netherby discoursed at length upon the vicar's increasing modernism, the portrait of her late husband, Colonel Edgar Netherby, retired, gave a subtle but definite shift. Not enough to alarm, just a half-inch tilt, as though the Colonel had grown weary of listening. "Good heavens," murmured Clara Liddon, her niece, setting down her spoon. "Eh?" Mrs. Netherby turned. Her late husband now appeared to regard the ceiling with mild irritation. Elsie went pale. "It's the wall, ma'am," she whispered. "That's where the noise was." Mrs. Netherby, determined to reassert command over both luncheon and household, rang for Jenkins the handyman, who appeared smelling faintly of paraffin and scepticism. He prodded the wall, sniffed, and declared, "Could be a bit of damp. Air gets trapped. Makes the plaster hum, like." Mrs. Netherby, who distrusted manual explanations, found this unsatisfactory. "Air," she repeated distastefully, "is not in the habit of displacing portraits." Nevertheless, Jenkins was dispatched to fetch tools, Elsie to polish the brass, and Clara to fetch smelling salts in case of hysteria. By late afternoon, all seemed calm again. The portrait rehung straight, the hum, if there ever was one, gone. Yet a faint tension lingered, something unspoken in the corridor air. At the constabulary, Inspector Pubright read the incident note brought in by Sergeant Love. It was written in Mrs. Netherby's brisk, looping hand. "A matter of domestic disturbance. No crime, yet, but a most peculiar auditory phenomenon in my residence. Kindly send someone discreet to ascertain whether madness, malice, or poor masonry is to blame." Purbright smiled faintly. The inspector had a deep respect for the townspeople's ingenuity in avoiding plain words. He could already imagine Mrs. Netherby's expression when someone discreet turned out to be himself. "Shall I go, sir?" asked Love, hopeful for diversion. "No," said Purbright mildly, folding the note. "If Mrs. Netherby believes the walls to be misbehaving, it would be discourteous to send a man who might laugh." Love considered this. "Would you call it a haunting, sir?" "I should think," said Purbright, rising to collect his hat, "that it will turn out to be something much less supernatural, and therefore more troubling." Evening brought drizzle and the comforting smell of paraffin lamps. At Beaconsfield Avenue, Mrs. Netherby received Purbright with the air of one greeting an ecclesiastical visitor rather than the police. "I am most anxious," she said, "not to become the subject of gossip." "Of course," Purbright murmured. "That would be tragic." She led him to the drawing-room, where the portrait of the Colonel looked slightly abashed beneath the gaslight. The wallpaper, a faded green damask, showed no sign of disturbance, though one could fancy that the pattern itself trembled faintly when stared at too long. Purbright examined the wall with a quiet curiosity that made even silence seem methodical. He touched the skirting board, sniffed near the vent, and straightened the portrait. "Damp, perhaps," he said, non-committal. "Jenkins said the same," Mrs. Netherby replied, rather disappointed. "But my housemaid insists she heard something alive." Purbright looked at the young woman who stood stiffly near the door. Her hands were red from scrubbing, her expression a mixture of fear and embarrassment. "Miss Moffat," he said gently. "When did you hear it last?" "Last night, sir. After the lamps was out, like someone sighing. Not close, just in the wall." Purbright nodded, his gaze moving from the maid to the ornate mirror opposite. Reflected, there was the small air vent above the fireplace, its grill faintly discoloured as though touched by something damp or dusty from within. He said nothing more. Instead, he smiled politely at Mrs. Netherby, thanked her for her time, and promised a quiet word with the local builder about her wall's mysterious respiration. As he stepped into the drizzle, he looked back once. Through the half-drawn curtain, the portrait of Colonel Netherby appeared, quite unmistakably, tilted again. By the following morning, Mrs. Netherby's breathing wall had achieved the distinction of being discussed in 3 hairdressers, the post office queue, and 1 Methodist sewing circle, all before the second post. Mrs. Hollis, who lived opposite Beaconsfield Avenue, claimed she had heard the ghostly sigh herself while hanging out the washing. "It were like a man who's tired of waiting for his tea," she said, which description was considered by her listeners to be both vivid and suspiciously familiar. At the same time, Miss Bunnage, the librarian, whispered that the Netherby house once belonged to a sea captain whose wife had died under whispering circumstances. Within an hour, this had transformed into a tale of secret passages and a murdered housemaid still gasping behind the plaster. By noon, the town's general opinion was that something improper had happened at Beaconsfield Avenue. What exactly varied according to one's temperament and moral outlook. Inspector Pubright, for his part, sat in his office reading the week's crime reports, which consisted largely of misplaced bicycles and an indecently worded letter posted to the rector's cat. Sergeant Love hovered by the window, newspaper in hand. "Front page of the Chronicle, sir," he said. "Mysterious manifestation at Beaconsfield Avenue. They've printed Mrs. Netherby's full name and everything." Purbright peered over his spectacles. "Ah, so much for discretion. They say the Colonel's ghost's been seen walking his dog in the garden." "Remarkable," said Purbright. "He didn't own one." Love grinned. "Still, it's cheered people up. There's been talk of forming a society for psychical research. Mr. Baines at the electric shops already offering discounted torches." Purbright sighed. Commerce adapts faster than theology. He folded the paper and rose. "Come along, love. We'd better pay another visit before the spiritualists start holding séances in Mrs. Netherby's dining room." The Netherby residence was in a state of siege, by manors if not mobs. A cluster of callers had already arrived under pretence of concern. Among them, Mrs. Peebles, the vicar's wife, was determined to offer sympathy, curiosity, and baked goods in equal measure. Mrs. Netherby received them in the parlour, which smelled faintly of polish and nervous energy. The portrait of the Colonel had been rehung again, this time slightly higher, as if to discourage further dissent. "Oh, Mrs. Netherby, we all understand," said Mrs. Peebles, her tone suggesting the opposite. "Old houses absorb their owners' moods, you know. My aunt's cottage used to groan whenever she prayed for humility." "I hardly think my walls are burdened with emotion," Mrs. Netherby replied, her chin lifted. "I shouldn't be so sure," murmured Miss Bunnage from the tea-table. Sometimes places remember, don't they, Inspector? Purbright, who had entered unnoticed, smiled pleasantly. Not always what one wishes them to, Miss Bunnage. There was a murmur of polite confusion. Purbright inclined his head to Mrs. Netherby. I hope my visit is not inconvenient. On the contrary, Inspector, she said, it is most inconvenient, but necessary. The women took their cue to rise, expressing that blend of regret and relief, particular to those who have exhausted a subject. When the parlour finally emptied, the house seemed to relax. Purbright removed his hat and looked around. A handsome room, he said. Good acoustics, too. Mrs. Netherby seated herself with an air of dignified endurance. If I had known my private misfortune would become the day's entertainment, I might have claimed influenza instead. Public attention, like influenza, passes, said Purbright gently. May I see the drawing-room again? Elsie, the housemaid, opened the door, avoiding both eye contact and the Colonel's portrait. Nothing's happened today, sir, she murmured. No noises? None at all. She hesitated. Only last night I found the air vent warm, like someone's breathing through it. Purbright examined the vent again. The grill was indeed faintly smeared, as if touched by a damp cloth. He crouched, noted a faint draught, and smiled slightly. Tell me, Miss Moffat, when you first heard it, were you alone? Yes, sir. Quite alone. She frowned. I'd just banked the fire, and Miss Liddon was upstairs writing letters. He turned to Mrs. Netherby, who stood like a monument of propriety. You mentioned your late husband had alterations made to this house? Years ago, a conservatory, and some dreadful piping installed by a cousin who fancied himself an engineer. Interesting, said Purbright. Was he a discreet cousin? Certainly not. He wrote everything down. Obsessive little notebooks. Do you still have them? She sniffed. Somewhere in the attic, I suppose. Why? Because even the dullest notes sometimes breathe more than the walls, he replied mildly. When they left the house, Love waited until they were out of earshot. So what do you think, sir? Bit of damp and imagination? Purbright's eyes twinkled. Perhaps. But imagination, Sergeant, is seldom distributed evenly. Mrs. Netherby has too little of it. Her maid, perhaps too much. Somewhere between them, I suspect, lies the truth and a rather human motive. They paused as a small group of townsfolk crossed the street to stare at the house. Among them, Mr. Baines of the electric shop pointed proudly at a sign reading, Ghost Detectors, 15% off during manifestation season. Love chuckled. Should we warn him about false advertising? Purbright shook his head. Let him enjoy his manifestation while it lasts. Sooner or later the walls will tell us something far more prosaic and much less comfortable. He glanced back once at the dim windows of Beaconsfield Avenue. The curtains shifted slightly, though no hand appeared to move them. That evening, in the parlour of the Crown and Mitre, the conversation took a more scandalous turn. Mr. Phipps, the insurance agent, lowered his voice. They say the Colonel hid something in those walls before he died. A will, or worse. Miss Bunnage shook her head. I heard it was letters. To a woman, not his wife. Same difference, said Phipps. The vicar, who had been pretending not to listen, sighed. If that's true, we should pray for forgiveness. Whose? Asked Mrs. Peebles, sweetly. The vicar paused. I hadn't quite decided. Meanwhile, at the Netherby residence, Clara Liddon sat at her writing desk staring at a single sheet of paper. In her lap lay a small silver key, newly polished. She turned it over, as if expecting it to whisper back. Downstairs, Elsie the maid paused on the landing. She could have sworn she heard something again, not a breath this time, but a sigh, long, soft, and unmistakably human. When she knocked on Mrs. Netherby's door to report it, no one answered. The door, she noticed, was locked from the inside. If Inspector Pubright had any single professional advantage over his contemporaries, it was his ability to make silence appear like kindness. In Flaxborough, where even suspicion was expected to be polite, this talent served him better than any fingerprint powder or notebook could. And so it was on the damp Thursday morning following the locked door incident that he accepted Mrs. Netherby's invitation to tea. The letter had arrived that morning, stiff, cream-coloured, written in a hand that implied both impatience and breeding. "Inspector, I should be obliged if you would call again. The disturbances persist. My niece is overwrought, my housemaid unreliable, and I refuse to endure both spiritualism and damp in the same residence." When Purbright arrived, the house was redolent of beeswax and anxiety. The front steps had been freshly scrubbed. The maid's bucket still dripped beside the hydrangeas. Mrs. Netherby greeted him in a gown of formidable black silk, her lips pursed as if resisting apology from the entire universe. "Inspector," she said, "I hope you are not expecting sandwiches. I've found luncheon an unsatisfactory meal since my husband's death." "Then we shall take our consolation in tea," Purbright said gently, and she allowed herself the faintest smile. They sat in the drawing-room once more, the scene of recent dramas. The portrait of Colonel Netherby now hung entirely straight, though, as Purbright privately observed, it seemed to be trying too hard to appear so. The tea arrived on a tray carried by Elsie Moffat, who placed it down as though delivering evidence in court. Her eyes lingered on the wall, then darted nervously to her mistress. "Sugar, Inspector?" Mrs. Netherby asked, without looking up. "Please." She stirred her own cup with an air of moral discipline. "The noises continue. Last night I distinctly heard a whisper from behind the wallpaper. I refuse to call it a haunting, but there it is." "Did anyone else hear it?" "Only my niece," she said shortly, though her description was unhelpful. She claimed it sounded like breathing after it, crying. Purbright's brow lifted slightly. "And Miss Liddon? She's well?" "She is delicate, Inspector. That's the word the family prefers. Delicate and inclined to take on burdens that aren't hers." "Such as?" Mrs. Netherby gave him a long, measuring look. "Employment of unsuitable servants, for instance. I never wanted Miss Moffat. My niece insisted upon her, a charity case from the parish. One sees the result." "Has Miss Moffat done anything besides hear things?" "She hides in the scullery, writes letters when she should be dusting, and listens at keyholes. My husband would never have tolerated it." Purbright's tone remained mild. "Perhaps your husband's methods were more direct." The widow's eyes narrowed, uncertain whether she'd been insulted. "He valued discipline." "I'm sure he did." A faint smile ghosted across Purbright's lips as he reached for his tea. His glance wandered over the room, the fine damask wallpaper, the ornamental vent above the fireplace, the faint discoloration where the portrait had once shifted. He set down his cup. "Would you object if I examined that wall again?" "By all means, it seems everyone else has." Purbright rose, crossed to the wall and tapped gently. A hollow resonance replied, not unlike a chest cavity's echo. He crouched and studied the skirting. There, faintly visible beneath a thin coat of polish, was a hairline crack. "Your handyman, Jenkins, has he done recent work here?" "Only a bit of repointing in the pantry." You keep household accounts, I suppose?" "Of course." "Could I see them?" She hesitated. "Is that relevant?" "Possibly not," Purbright said pleasantly. "But sometimes ledgers breathe more freely than walls." After a pause, she summoned Elsie. Bring the household ledger, the new one, not the old. The maid obeyed, returning with a slim blue notebook. Purbright flicked through it casually, not reading so much as noticing. The ink grew fresher toward the end, but one page near the middle had been torn out cleanly. "You keep careful accounts," he said. "I pride myself on it. Who last entered a note here?" "My niece. She assists me when the figures become tedious." Purbright closed the book and smiled. "An admirable partnership." He stood, thanked her for the tea, and said, "If you'd permit, I'll have the builder you mentioned inspect the wall's structure. A Mr. Lorimer, I believe?" "Retired these 10 years," she said curtly. "But you may find him at the Fox and Hounds afternoon. He drinks for recreation, not weakness." "An excellent habit in moderation," said Purbright. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into a gentle rain, the sort that encouraged introspection. Purbright and Sergeant Love stood by the gate. "Sir," Love ventured, "what do you make of her? Sharp as vinegar, that one." "Indeed," Purbright said, "but vinegar, Sergeant, can be very revealing when it touches certain metals." Love frowned. "Meaning what, sir?" "Meaning?" Purbright said. "I'd like to know what was written on that missing ledger page." That afternoon, while Purbright paid a visit to Mr. Lorimer, the retired builder, a quieter scene unfolded in the Netherby attic. Elsie Moffat, carrying a duster and a sense of dread, climbed the narrow stairs. The attic smelled of dust, camphor, and old sins. She had been told to fetch nothing in particular. Mrs. Netherby's orders were often more about obedience than errands. But curiosity, that fragile engine of both gossip and crime, led her to a small tin trunk near the eaves. Inside lay old notebooks bound in cracked leather. The first was labelled Colonel E. Netherby, House Alterations, 1938. Elsie leafed through sketches of pipes, vents, and measurements. Then she stopped. On one page, in thick pencil, "Service passage to parlour bricked over. Access maintained via grill in chimney wall." She stared, heart thudding. The note had been underlined twice. Beneath it, written faintly in another hand, "Never open." Agreed. The maid closed the book as if it had burned her fingers. At precisely that moment, Purbright sat with Mr. Lorimer in the smoky back room of the Fox and Hounds. The old builder was polishing his pint glass with an air of dignity not shared by the glass itself. "Ah, yes," he said, after a moment's thought. "The Netherby house, odd one, that. You know, we put in a false wall back in 38. Old Colonel didn't want the staff corridor showing, said he'd rather hide the passage than the servants." "Hide it?" Purbright asked mildly. "Aye, bricked it up clean, but he kept a vent through to the parlour. For air, he said. Never made sense to me. No one needed air from that side of the house." Purbright nodded, setting down his teacup. "Did he ever mention what was behind the wall once it was sealed?" The builder frowned. "Just said, better buried." Purbright smiled faintly. How very English. That evening, back at the station, Purbright wrote a single note in his pocketbook. "False wall confirmed. Vent connects to sealed passage. Ledger page missing. Emotional undercurrents. Fear, guilt, inheritance." He underlined the last word twice, then leaned back, listening to the quiet hum of the office clock. "Sergeant," he said finally, "remind me to check the probate records for the late Colonel Netherby." "Yes, sir." "Something tells me," Purbright murmured, "that this particular haunting has a distinctly financial afterlife." Morning broke in Flaxborough with that thin, reluctant sunlight that flatters neither house nor human. At Beaconsfield Avenue, the light seemed to pause politely before entering, as though aware that Mrs. Netherby's approval was not easily won. Breakfast was taken in the smaller dining room, a setting the late Colonel had referred to as more intimate, and his widow now described as sufficiently economical. The table bore its usual arrangement of silver, marmalade, and unspoken resentment. Clara Liddon sat opposite her aunt, pushing a piece of toast with abstracted care. Her eyes were heavy, her hair not yet properly arranged. "You were awake late," Mrs. Netherby observed. "I was writing letters," Clara replied. "To whom?" "Friends." Mrs. Netherby's tone sharpened. "Friends or one friend?" Clara's answer was slow. "Does it matter?" "It matters if the correspondence involves this household. You forget that your position here is not—" "Secure?" Clara finished, her voice steady but low. "I'm aware, Aunt." The silence that followed was long and thin. Then Elsie entered, carrying the Morning Post. "One letter, Mum," she said. "For Miss Liddon." Mrs. Netherby's brows rose. "You may leave it on the sideboard, Elsie." Clara reached for it quickly, too quickly, and her aunt's eyes caught the motion with the precision of a hawk spotting a field mouse. By 10 o'clock, the house's quiet order had fractured. The ledger, the new household account book Purbright had perused the previous day, was missing. "Gone?" Elsie said, helplessly twisting her apron. "I swear I left it in the drawer, Ma'am, same as always." Mrs. Netherby stood at the bureau, lips pressed so tightly that her face seemed carved from alabaster. "It did not simply go anywhere," she said. "Books do not possess legs." "No, Ma'am." "Then find it." Clara, pale and strained, spoke from the doorway. "Perhaps it's been misplaced. You were rather tired last night, Aunt." "Tiredness," said Mrs. Netherby sharply, "does not produce larceny." Elsie's face reddened. "I've not stolen anything, Mum." The older woman's gaze chilled the room. "We shall see." At 11, Inspector Pubright arrived, summoned not by formality but by gossip, which had a way of reaching him faster than the telephone ever could. He was shown into the drawing-room, where Mrs. Netherby stood beside the bureau like a prosecutor guarding the dock. "Inspector," she said, "I require your assistance again. The ledger has vanished." "Indeed." "Taken, removed. I do not accuse anyone yet, but the possibilities are few." Purbright glanced toward Elsie, who stood white-faced by the window, and Clara, who avoided both their eyes. "When did you last see it, Mrs. Netherby?" "Yesterday afternoon when you were here." "And when did you next notice it missing?" "This morning." "The drawer was open?" "Unlocked?" "I do not lock drawers in my own house." Purbright nodded mildly. An admirable philosophy, though not without risk. He bent and examined the bureau, not with forensic intensity, but with the same quiet curiosity one gives a half-finished crossword. "The drawer's polish is uneven," he said. "It's been wiped recently." Mrs. Netherby stiffened. "I had Elsie dust the room last night." Purbright turned to the maid. "Did you, Miss Moffat?" Elsie swallowed. "Yes, sir. Only dustin', I swear. I never opened no drawers." He straightened, looking from one woman to the other. "Would you object if I asked to see the older ledgers as well?" Mrs. Netherby hesitated. "They're in the writing cabinet." "Why?" "Pure curiosity," he said, smiling faintly. "I find accounts are the most honest form of confession." While Mrs. Netherby fetched the cabinet key, Purbright's gaze drifted to Clara, who stood by the window pretending to admire the geraniums. "You seem thoughtful, Miss Liddon." "Only tired," she said softly. "Of sleepless nights?" Her eyes flickered to him. "How did you— You look as if you'd been listening for something." Clara managed a faint smile. "Everyone in this house is listening, Inspector, to walls, to footsteps, to each other." "That must be exhausting." "It is." Mrs. Netherby re-entered then, and the fragile air of confidence between them evaporated. She placed 2 older ledgers on the table. "Here. My household has nothing to hide." Purbright nodded, thanked her, and made a small show of glancing through them. Then, closing the books, he asked with apparent casualness, "Do you know anyone who might wish to see your accounts, Mrs. Netherby? A creditor, perhaps? A solicitor?" "My affairs are perfectly in order." "Of course." He adjusted his hat, preparing to leave. "One last thing about the wall. Has the breathing stopped?" Mrs. Netherby's expression twitched. "It comes and goes. Last night there was tapping, but I am determined not to dignify it with fear." "Commendable," said Purbright. "Fear, after all, is rarely useful, whereas deceit usually works very hard, for very little reward." Her eyes narrowed. "Inspector, are you implying—" "Nothing, madam, merely reflecting." He bowed slightly and left her staring after him. At the station later that day, Purbright sat across from Sergeant Love, who was wrestling with the moral arithmetic of suspects. "Could be the maid, sir," Love said, "if she took the ledger to hide something." "Possible, though she seems more frightened of being blamed than of being caught." "Then Miss Liddon?" Purbright considered this. "Perhaps, but guilt seldom looks so fatigued." "What about the aunt herself?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Ah, the most interesting possibility of all. When respectable people mislay things, Sergeant, they often do so in the hope of forgetting what they once contained." Love frowned. "You think she destroyed it?" "I think she's tempted to." He rose and paced to the window, watching the street below. "The ledger's disappearance serves one purpose, to obscure something recently recorded. A sum, perhaps, or a name. We must find what was worth erasing." That evening, Clara Liddon sat in her bedroom, the missing ledger open on her lap. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to the torn page, a page she had herself removed. Beneath the candlelight, the ink gleamed faintly. "Paid in cash to E. Moffat, 3 Tla, for services rendered March 17th. Authorized by C. Liddon, on behalf of A. Netherby." It wasn't the payment that frightened her. It was the line written faintly beneath, in a smaller hand, her aunt's, "Destroy if asked." Clara closed the book, her breath shallow. From somewhere deep within the house came a faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, pause, tap. She rose, clutching the ledger, and crossed to the wall. The air from the vent brushed her cheek, warm and oddly human. Then just for a moment she heard it again, the unmistakable sigh. At precisely that hour, Inspector Pubright, walking home past the gas lamps of Market Street, was reflecting on the curious elasticity of truth. "People," he mused aloud, "rarely lie outright. They merely tidy reality until it looks more presentable." He paused at the crossing, adjusted his hat against the drizzle, and smiled faintly. "Still," he added to no one in particular, "there's always one detail they forget to polish." Inspector Pubright had always believed that the past, like bad wallpaper, never truly stayed hidden. It simply waited for the right damp to bring its pattern back. On that grey Monday morning, the damp came in the form of Mr. Edgar Lorimer, retired builder, widower, and custodian of Flaxborough's collective memory. He was a man whose face resembled both the bricks he'd laid and the patience required to align them. Purbright found him once more at the Fox and Hounds, occupying the same corner seat, pint glass polished to the point of moral conviction. "Inspector," said Lorimer, tipping his cap without quite removing it. "Come about the Netherby job again, have you?" "If you don't mind." "I never mind talking, sir. Talking's cheaper than plaster." Purbright smiled, seated himself opposite, and ordered tea from the barman, whose expression suggested this was an act of heresy. "Now," said Lorimer, leaning back. "You'll be wanting to know about that passage." "I believe you said it was bricked up in 1938. "Right." The Colonel had it done sudden-like. Said he didn't want the servants' corridors showing from the new parlour. "We built a false wall, 6 inches deep, neat as you like. But that weren't the strange bit." "Oh?" "The strange bit was what he did before we closed it." Purbright stirred his tea. "Go on." "Well, the Colonel brings in a small chest, mahogany brass corners. Didn't look heavy, but he carried it himself, wouldn't let no one else touch it. Puts it right in the hollow where the vent ran through, says to me, 'Lorimer, make sure no drafts reach this side again. This space is for quiet things.'" "Quiet things," Purbright repeated. "A curious phrase." Lorimer nodded. "That's what I thought, but the Colonel was a decent payer and a worse talker. After we finished, he tipped me double and said, 'Not a word to the missus about the alteration, eh?' I took that to mean he'd changed his mind on the plan or whatnot. Thought no more of it." Purbright watched the man's face carefully. "And you're certain nothing was removed afterward?" "Certain. That wall's been solid ever since. If something's breathing behind it now, it's got a good pair of lungs for its age." Outside, the day had taken on that particular dullness of late March. Neither rain nor light, but a sort of patient waiting. Purbright stood by the doorway, lighting his pipe, when he heard footsteps approach behind him. "Inspector," said a mild, embarrassed voice. It was Reverend Chalmers, the town's vicar, a man of such mildness that even his sermons apologized for themselves. "I heard," he began hesitantly, "about the situation at the Netherby residence. A rather distressing business." Purbright nodded. "The walls, yes, they seem to have taken up a second career in exhaling." The vicar smiled weakly. "Indeed, but I wondered, would it be indiscreet if I mentioned something told me in confidence some years ago?" "That depends, Reverend, on whether it was told to you or at you." The vicar chuckled faintly. "Quite. Well, it was by the Colonel himself not long before he passed. He came to confession, not something he was in the habit of doing, mind you, and spoke of a domestic matter that had, in his words, become structurally unsound." Purbright's brows rose. "Structurally?" "Yes. I assumed at the time he meant his marriage. He said some things must be sealed to keep the house upright." "How very architectural," murmured Purbright. "And metaphorical." "Indeed, but now hearing of noises from behind that very wall." The vicar's voice trailed off. Purbright nodded gravely. "You did right to tell me. If sin and masonry have begun to share foundations, we must see which cracks first." That afternoon, Purbright returned to the station and summoned Sergeant Love, who arrived still dusted with the remains of a jam donut. "Sergeant," said Purbright, "I want you to look up the probate file for one Colonel Edgar Netherby, year of death, 1942. See if anything in the estate inventory mentions sealed property, cash reserves, or undistributed effects." Love nodded. "And if it does? Then we may find that Mrs. Netherby's haunting began with an accountancy error." By evening, Love was back with a folder. "Here it is, sir. Probate dated July 42, estate valued at just under £4,000. Most of it went to the widow, of course, but—" He handed over a faded sheet. "There's a clause about a missing box." Purbright read aloud. "One mahogany chest, contents unspecified, believed retained by the deceased at his residence for personal safekeeping, not found at time of inventory." He looked up. "How very interesting." Love frowned. "You think that's what's in the wall?" "I think," said Purbright slowly, "that something in this house has been breathing for far longer than the maid imagines. Guilt, perhaps, or opportunity." He rose, took his hat, and added, "We'll pay the widow one more visit tomorrow, but not to discuss ghosts." At Beaconsfield Avenue, That same evening, Mrs. Netherby dined alone. Clara had pled a headache. Elsie had taken to bed early, claiming chills. The widow regarded her roast chicken with suspicion and her decanter of sherry with fondness. She had not yet told anyone, not even Clara, that the breathing had returned. This time it came while she was writing letters in her husband's old study. The sound was soft at first, then distinct, a slow inhalation, followed by a faint scratching. "Rats," she whispered aloud to steady herself. "Just rats." But when she turned toward the wainscoting, she saw the tiniest puff of dust emerge from a hairline crack near the skirting board, as though the wall itself had sighed. Upstairs, Clara was not sleeping. The missing ledger lay open on her dressing table. She had replaced the torn page with another, carefully rewritten, perfectly forged, and containing nothing incriminating. She told herself this was not deceit, it was protection. Yet as she blew out her lamp, she felt the faintest movement of air along the floorboards, a whisper that seemed to come through the house rather than around it. She lay awake, listening, until the clock struck midnight. At the constabulary, Purbright sat alone in the half-light, pipe smoke curling into thought. He opened his notebook and wrote, "Colonel's confession, via vicar." Some things must be sealed. Builder confirms chest placed inside wall. Probate notes chest missing. Ledger removed. Concealment of payment or rediscovery. He paused, tapping his pen. Then another note, underlined twice. Find what the colonel sealed. And who knew? He closed the book, extinguished his pipe, and smiled faintly to himself. "Breathing walls," he murmured. "It's usually not ghosts, just secrets looking for fresh air." It was rare in Flaxborough for anything to happen twice. Once was quite enough to fill conversation until harvest. And yet, when Mrs. Netherby's walls decided to perform again, they chose to do so in the presence of witnesses, an act of considerable bad manners by local standards. The occasion was a Wednesday afternoon tea for the Parish Benevolent Fund, held reluctantly at Beaconsfield Avenue after Mrs. Peebles declared her own drawing room unfit for Christian. Hospitality until the wallpaper dries. By 3 o'clock, 6 respectable ladies had gathered amid the damask and doilies. The table groaned with sponge cakes and disapproval. Mrs. Netherby sat in her accustomed chair, 1 degree stiffer than the furniture, presiding with the air of someone doing charity to rather than for others. Clara poured tea, her movements distracted, while Elsie hovered by the sideboard, pretending to dust, but clearly listening for more than crumbs. "So dreadful, this business with the noises," murmured Miss Bunnage. "One feels quite uneasy in one's own home. Last night my pantry door rattled and I nearly telephoned the constable." "I doubt the constable would have improved matters," said Mrs. Peebles, stirring her cup. "The supernatural rarely respects uniforms." "I don't believe in spirits," declared Mrs. Netherby, "except the liquid ones." Laughter, polite, nervous. At that precise moment, as though the house itself had been waiting for its cue, there came from behind the parlour wall a long, hollow thud, followed by a low, sighing sound, unmistakably human in rhythm. Every head turned. Mrs. Peebles gasped. "Merciful heavens!" "Goodness me!" whispered Miss Bunnage, gripping her saucer. Clara froze, teapot poised mid-air. Elsie dropped her duster and backed away, eyes wide. The noise came again, after dull, deliberate tapping. 3 beats, a pause, then 2. Mrs. Netherby's face had gone quite pale. "Ladies," she said with the composure of someone holding in a scream, "I think we shall adjourn tea to the garden." But as she rose, the portrait of the Colonel, that perennial spectator, gave a subtle creak on its hook and tilted once more. Someone screamed. Someone else crossed herself. The room dissolved into chaos of rustling skirts and spilled tea. By 4:30, the story had made its way via breathless accounts to the Flaxborough Chronicle office. By 5, a reporter was cycling frantically toward Beaconsfield Avenue. By 6, Inspector Pubright was already there. He arrived to find the house unusually busy. Neighbours loitering outside, one spiritualist medium clutching a Bible and a crystal, and Sergeant Love attempting to explain that police procedure did not extend to ghost catching. "Sir," said Love, looking relieved at Purbright's appearance. "They've all heard it this time. Half the town, practically." Purbright nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then we must congratulate the ghost on its timing." He stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender polish and hysteria. Mrs. Netherby awaited him in the drawing room, still trembling, but determined to appear unshaken. "You see, Inspector," she said, "I am not delusional. You have witnesses now." "Indeed," Purbright said softly. "But witnesses, in my experience, tend to multiply rather than clarify events." Clara stood by the window, pale but dry-eyed. Elsie hovered behind her, gripping her apron. "Tell me exactly what you heard," said Purbright. "A sort of breathing," said Clara. "Followed by tapping. It felt close, not like something from the pipes." Purbright nodded, then turned to Elsie. "You, Miss Moffat?" "Same, sir, and—" she hesitated, glancing at her mistress. "And I smelled something, like gas, but not strong, sweetish, maybe." Purbright's gaze sharpened. "Gas?" "Yes, sir, only for a moment." He crouched by the wall, ran his fingers along the skirting, and paused at a faint crack. "Mrs. Netherby, may I ask when this room was last redecorated?" "Not since before the war," she said. "Curious," murmured Purbright. "Wallpaper lasts longer than conscience, but seldom this long." He rose, brushing dust from his sleeve. "Would you allow me to have the walls sounded by a builder tomorrow morning?" "Do whatever you must," said Mrs. Netherby. "Only make it stop." Outside, in the fading light, Purbright and Love stood by the gate. "Well, sir," Love said, "you can't deny it's peculiar." "Oh, it's peculiar," Purbright agreed, "but not, I think, supernatural. Gas, perhaps, or heat through a vent. Still what, sir?" Purbright's eyes were thoughtful. "The sound occurred during a gathering. An audience was guaranteed. The house, one might say, chose its moment with theatrical flair. Now, who benefits from such a performance?" Love frowned. "You mean someone caused it?" "Perhaps. Though motive, Sergeant, is the most fragile thing in the world until it hardens into guilt." That evening, in the Crown and Mitre, speculation ran ahead of sense. "They say the Colonel's treasure's walled up in there," declared Mr. Phipps, waving his pint. "That's what the breathing is, the poor soul guarding it." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Peebles. "It's a warning from heaven to the proud." "Or a vent from the old coal furnace," muttered Mr. Lorimer from his corner, unheard. Meanwhile, at Beaconsfield Avenue, the house had fallen silent again. Clara sat at her dressing table, hands clasped tightly. She could still hear the echo of that sound, not the thud itself, but the pause that had followed, as if someone were waiting for an answer. She rose, crossed to the wall, and pressed her ear to the paper. Nothing. Then a voice behind her. "Miss Liddon." She spun round. It was Elsie, pale and breathless. "I'm sorry, miss, but there's something you ought to see." The maid led her downstairs into the scullery. The air there was cooler, damper. From the far wall, near the back stair, came a faint hiss, the unmistakable whisper of escaping gas. Clara covered her mouth. "Good heavens! Has it been leaking all this time?" Elsie nodded. "Jenkins checked the pipe last month, said it were fine, but it's coming through a crack. There." She pointed, and Clara saw it a hairline fissure running up the plaster, in line, she realized with a chill, with the wall behind the drawing-room vent. The next morning, Purbright returned with Mr. Lorimer and 2 constables. Mrs. Netherby had withdrawn upstairs, declaring she refused to witness men breaking her house apart like a loaf. Lorimer examined the wall, tapped twice, and shook his head. Hollow, right enough, but not just air. There's summat solid behind. Open it, Purbright said quietly. They began carefully chiselling along the vent's edge. Dust rose in pale sighs. Old plaster fell away like brittle skin. Then with a final crack, the wall gave a faint echoing huff. The sound of air, long trapped, finding its way out. Behind the loosened bricks lay darkness, and the faint outline of something wooden. Lorimer reached in with a gloved hand. Feels like a chest, sir. Small one. Purbright's eyes narrowed. Lift it out. They did so gently. It was, indeed, a mahogany chest, brass-cornered, streaked with age. The lock was rusted, the hinges fragile. "Shall I open it?" asked Lorimer. "Not yet," said Purbright. "We'll take it to the station." He turned to the others. "Seal this section. I don't want a soul inside until I've examined the contents." That evening, Purbright sat alone in his office, the chest before him. He cleaned the dust from its lid, revealing a faint monogram, E.N. He tested the lock gently. It gave with a soft click. Inside were papers, brittle, yellowed, folded carefully. He lifted the top sheet and read, his brows slowly tightening. After a long silence, he replaced it, closed the lid and murmured, "Well, Colonel, you've managed to haunt us after all. Just not in the way anyone expected." He turned off the lamp. The chest sat in shadow, and as the inspector stepped away, the faintest breath of air escaped from within, like a final sigh. By Thursday morning, the chest had achieved a status in Flaxborough usually reserved for royal visits and escaped parrots. Its removal from Beaconsfield Avenue, witnessed by 6 neighbours pretending to prune roses, had already inspired a dozen theories. Mrs. Peebles was certain it contained treasure. Miss Bunnage insisted it must be bones. Mr. Phipps, who had lately taken to reading detective novels with excessive confidence, declared it was evidence of high-level conspiracy, probably political. Only Purbright, unbothered by the public's imagination, sat at his desk that morning examining what was inside. The chest's contents were far from sensational at first glance. A handful of letters, a faded notebook, 2 sealed envelopes tied with string, and a small silver photograph frame turned face down. He began with the letters. The paper was thick, the ink uneven, the handwriting unmistakably male, strong, disciplined, military. Each was signed E.N., the earliest, dated March 1938, read simply, "To be held in trust, unseen. I do this not for concealment but for peace." The later ones grew less formal. One, in particular, drew Purbright's attention. "If anything happens to me, the truth must remain where it lies. No one in the house must ever discover it. Agatha would not understand." The signature, faint but legible, Edgar Netherby. Purbright placed the letter aside, then untied the string from the smaller bundle. Inside were pages in a different hand, finer, more elegant. He read the first line and stopped. It began, "My dearest Edgar." He read on silently for several minutes. The tone was intimate, but not scandalous, tender, cautious, perhaps fearful. The woman wrote of loneliness and understanding denied. She mentioned meeting by the west gate after dusk, and closed each letter with "Your A." Purbright sat back, pipe unlit, eyes distant. Sergeant Love entered quietly, carrying a mug of tea. "Morning, sir. That the ghost in there?" "In a manner of speaking," said Purbright. He passed one of the letters across. Love read the opening lines, then coloured faintly. "Well, it's not the sort of haunting the church approves of." "No," said Purbright. "Adultery rarely leaves ectoplasm." Love blinked. "You mean Mrs. Netherby's husband had—" "A liaison, perhaps before the war, perhaps not long after. The initials A are telling, though whether they stand for Agatha or another woman remains to be seen." Love frowned. Could it be the wife herself? Letters to remind her of something private? "Possible," said Purbright. "But Mrs. Netherby does not strike me as the sentimental archivist type. She'd sooner burn her emotions than catalogue them." He tapped the letters thoughtfully. No, these were meant to be hidden, not preserved for nostalgia, but buried for safety. By midday, the inspector was back at Beaconsfield Avenue. Mrs. Netherby received him in her upstairs sitting room, wrapped in a shawl and dignity. "I trust," she said, "that you have opened the chest." "I have." Her lips tightened. "And?" "Papers. Nothing to frighten the clergy, though enough to interest historians." She gave a small, dry laugh. "My husband was neither saint nor scholar. I doubt his handwriting would interest anyone." "Indeed," said Purbright. "Did he ever mention a woman, someone he corresponded with?" Her face froze. "A woman?" "Yes. Perhaps a friend or a confidant." Mrs. Netherby drew herself up. "The Colonel had many acquaintances, Inspector. Some male, some female. I was not in the habit of supervising his stationery." "Of course," said Purbright evenly. "But one of the letters is signed A. May I assume that stands for Agatha?" Her mouth tightened. "You may assume what you like." "That's very generous of you," said Purbright mildly. She rose abruptly. "Inspector, I have no interest in revisiting the past. My husband's failings, whatever they were, are of no concern to the law." Purbright inclined his head. "I agree entirely. The law, however, occasionally wanders into human territory." Her eyes flashed. "Meaning?" "Meaning that secrecy tends to breathe, Mrs. Netherby. And when it's sealed too tightly, it makes quite a noise trying to escape." She turned away. "You speak in riddles, Inspector." "Not intentionally," he said, and took his leave. Outside, Sergeant Love waited by the gate. "Well, sir?" Purbright adjusted his hat. She knew. "Knew what, sir?" "That there was something behind that wall long before her housemaid ever heard it. The noises, the gas, the ledger, all distractions, convenient ones. You think she faked the haunting? Not herself, but perhaps she let it flourish. A frightened servant is less likely to question a locked door." That evening, the Flaxborough Chronicle published a piece headlined, "Inspector Pubright investigates mystery chest in haunted house." The article was brief, uninformative, and factually courageous. It quoted a reliable source close to the investigation, almost certainly Sergeant Love, describing the event as a purely material matter, though of delicate nature. Within hours, the entire town interpreted material matter as hidden treasure. By nightfall, 3 amateur ghost hunters and 1 hopeful solicitor had offered their services. Meanwhile, in the Netherby household, nerves frayed quietly. Clara Liddon avoided her aunt, choosing to dine in her room. Elsie moved about the house like a shadow, pausing at each creak of the floorboards. And Mrs. Netherby, who had always prided herself on composure, found herself listening once again for noises that might, just might, absolve her of guilt. That night, at 11, there came another sound, but different this time. Not breathing, not sighing, a soft tap, 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 as of something metallic striking wood. Mrs. Netherby lit a candle and went to the study. The noise came from the fireplace. She bent close, heart thudding, and saw, half buried in soot, a small brass key. She stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up. The initials EN were engraved faintly along its stem. For the first time in days, she smiled. At the constabulary, Purbright sat late, rereading the letters. He had arranged them by date, tracing the slow, painful arc of the Colonel's private guilt. The final one, written only weeks before his death, read, "If Agatha finds this, tell her I never meant her harm, but some truths are walls. They hold the house up by keeping out the light." Purbright closed the envelope and exhaled. "Walls again," he murmured. He made one final note in his book. Mrs. Netherby, defensive, fearful, but relieved. Clara, anxious, conflicted, possibly protecting aunt. Elsie, witness and instrument. Wall, no longer metaphorical. Key question, what else did the Colonel hide? He underlined the last phrase and added, almost to himself, if guilt is a kind of architecture, this house is due for collapse. Flaxborough's vicarage was a square, respectable house of brick and ivy, whose theological gravity was slightly undermined by the hens that scratched beneath its hydrangeas. Inside, the atmosphere was equal parts holiness and damp. Inspector Pubright arrived at 10:30, politely brushing his shoes before stepping over the threshold. He was received by Reverend Chalmers, a man whose clerical collar seemed to perform the primary function of holding him together. "Inspector," the vicar said, extending both hands as if greeting a penitent rather than a policeman. "You'll forgive the clutter. The Mothers' Union left their pamphlets again." "I find pamphlets comforting," Purbright said mildly. "They suggest someone, somewhere, believes the world can be improved by paper." The vicar led him into the study, a small room with shelves of books that had long since given up trying to stand upright. A kettle whistled faintly from a spirit stove in the corner. "I've been expecting you," said Chalmers, "ever since I heard about the chest." The Colonel's affairs were curious, even for Flaxborough. Curious in what way? Chalmers hesitated. He had a conscience that didn't quite fit his convictions. The sort of man who confessed often enough to suggest he enjoyed the relief. "Confession," said Purbright, "is a comfort, especially when one intends to continue the habit requiring it." The vicar smiled ruefully. "Indeed. But the Colonel's final visit? I remember it clearly. It was raining. He'd come from the railway station. He looked frightened, though he'd have denied it. Spoke of something he'd hidden. Said it must stay hidden, even from his wife." Purbright nodded slowly. "Yes, the chest." "Ah." Chalmers folded his hands. "Then he truly did it." "He did, and now it's been found." The vicar's brows lifted. "Found? Good Lord, and what was in it?" "Letters," Purbright said. "Between the Colonel and a woman, how initial A." Chalmers' face softened with something like pity. "Ah, then it was as I feared." Purbright regarded him quietly. "You knew." "Not precisely, but he once said, in that last confession, that he'd wronged two women, one through neglect, the other through affection. I presumed the first was his wife. And the second? Her name, I believe, was Alice." "Surname?" "Wilton. She was a companion to the Colonel's sister. She lived in the house for a time, as a sort of secretary, after her husband's death, left rather suddenly." Purbright tapped his notebook thoughtfully. "Do you recall when she left?" "Spring of 1938, the same week the builders came, I believe." Purbright looked up. "And you're certain of that?" "Quite. The Colonel mentioned he was having certain alterations made. Said it was for his wife's peace of mind." Purbright's expression didn't change, but his silence deepened. The vicar poured tea into mismatched cups. "I remember visiting after Miss Wilton left. Mrs. Netherby was different. Not angry, precisely, but brittle, like someone who'd learned the worst thing possible, that she was not indispensable. Purbright took the cup. Did she ever mention Miss Wilton again? Never, nor did anyone else. In Flaxborough, Inspector, the polite thing about scandal is that it only has to be half buried before people stop digging. Purbright smiled faintly. Unless, of course, it starts to breathe. Chalmers looked at him sharply. You think the noises? Not ghosts, Reverend. Just consequences with poor ventilation. After tea, the vicar led him to the church where sunlight through the windows made dust look devout. They stopped beside a small brass plaque beneath the choir stall. In memory of Alice Wilton, 1903-1938. The heart knoweth its own bitterness. Purbright read the inscription quietly. Died the same year as the wall was sealed. Yes, said Chalmers. Influenza, they said, a sudden illness, buried out at St. Jude's. They said. The vicar sighed. There were whispers that she took something. But the doctor was discreet, and the colonel persuasive. Purbright nodded. And the widow? She attended the funeral, said Chalmers softly, in silence, the only mourner who didn't cry. Outside the churchyard, the inspector paused by the gate. Reverend, he said, you once told me the colonel said something about keeping the house upright. Yes. Some things must be sealed to keep the house upright. Those were his exact words. Purbright gazed at the rows of gravestones. He wasn't speaking architecturally, he was speaking morally. He bricked up his shame and called it renovation. Chalmers looked uneasy. And now that shame's been uncovered? Now, said Purbright, it's no longer his, it's hers. That afternoon, word of the discovery reached the Flaxborough Chronicle. The editor, with the solemnity of a man serving the public interest, ran another headline. Tragic love behind haunted wall. Vicar refuses comment. The town, gratified to find its gossip sanctified by print, reacted with enthusiasm. By tea-time, there were whispers that Mrs. Netherby had murdered the colonel's mistress and entombed her behind the wall. By supper, she had allegedly done the same to 2 others, and possibly a Labrador. Purbright returned to Beaconsfield Avenue at dusk. Mrs. Netherby was in the parlour, staring at the empty wall where the chest had been found. "I hope you're satisfied, Inspector," she said without turning. "You've given the town its carnival." "I'm sorry for that," Purbright said gently. "It was never my intention to exhume emotion, only fact." She laughed bitterly. "Emotion doesn't stay buried. You've proved that. Did you enjoy your talk with the vicar?" Purbright's brows rose slightly. "You knew I'd see him." "I knew you'd be thorough. The colonel always said that about you." "That's very kind." She faced him now, her expression more tired than angry. "Tell me, Inspector, was she really in there?" "No," he said softly. "Only her letters." For a moment her eyes shone with something unreadable, relief, grief, perhaps both. Then she sank into a chair. "Then it was all for nothing," she whispered. Purbright said nothing. Silence, he'd learned, was sometimes kinder than truth. Outside, the evening air was heavy and gold with the scent of rain. Sergeant Love, waiting by the gate, asked, "Well, sir, was she guilty of anything?" Purbright looked up at the darkening sky. "Of being human, Sergeant, which, in Flaxborough, is almost a scandal in itself." He walked on, hands clasped behind his back, and added quietly, "The dead have stopped breathing now. It's the living I'm worried about." The weather, as if sharing Flaxborough's mood, had turned curiously mild, the sort of deceptive calm that precedes both thunderstorms and scandal. Inspector Pubright, never one to rush the climax of human folly, decided to arrange the day's business under the guise of social civility. Thus he requested tea at Beaconsfield Avenue to clarify certain administrative matters. The phrase was chosen with care. In Flaxborough, nothing inspired both fear and compliance quite like administrative matters. Mrs. Netherby received him in the drawing-room. She had resumed her usual armour of black silk and pearls, but there was something faintly hollow in her manner, as though she had been rehearsing indifference and grown tired halfway through. Clara sat by the window, pale but composed. Elsie, summoned to serve, lingered near the door with the tremulous dignity of a defendant at a garden party. "Inspector," Mrs. Netherby began, "I do hope this won't take long. We've had quite enough excitement." "Only a few questions," Purbright said, smiling pleasantly. "And I promise, none about ghosts." That earned a thin smile from Clara. He waited for the tea to be poured, then spoke conversationally. "It's remarkable how the Colonel's handwriting has endured. His letters were legible, decisive, almost architectural." Mrs. Netherby stiffened slightly. "He was a man of order?" "Yes. He seemed to favour structures that concealed as much as they revealed." She frowned. "Meaning?" "Oh, just an observation," said Purbright, as he accepted a biscuit. "Though I was struck by a small practical detail, the key to that chest." Mrs. Netherby said nothing. "It must have gone missing for some time," Purbright continued mildly. "And yet yesterday, I understand, you found it in your fireplace?" Clara's head turned sharply. "Aunt?" Her aunt's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer. "Yes," she said, too quickly. "An odd coincidence." Purbright's tone remained gentle. "A coincidence indeed, especially since the keyhole showed no signs of rust until quite recently. The silence that followed had the texture of frost." Clara's voice broke it first, small and brittle. You opened it, didn't you, Aunt, before the police took it?" Mrs. Netherby turned on her niece with sudden, furious dignity. "I glanced inside, yes. I had every right to. My house, my husband's possessions." "But why not tell Inspector Pubright?" "Because," she said, "it was none of his business." Purbright's voice was mild as sunlight. "Forgive me, madam, but when the past begins to leak into the present, through vents, cracks and rumours, it becomes everyone's business." She stared at him. "And what is it you think I've done, Inspector? Murdered a memory?" He smiled faintly. "Not quite. But perhaps you've tried to keep one buried." Clara stood, trembling. "It was you," she whispered. "You wrote that note, in the one in the ledger. Destroy if asked." Mrs. Netherby's expression did not change. "If you mean to say I protected this family from disgrace, then yes." "You lied to me," Clara said. "You let Elsie take the blame, and you knew what the noise was, gas leaking through your husband's false wall." Mrs. Netherby rose, her height suddenly imposing again. "I knew something was wrong. I hoped it would stop. If it hadn't been for your foolish curiosity, it would have killed us all," Clara finished. The two women faced one another, mirror images, separated by 30 years of repression. Purbright let the silence draw out, then said softly, "I believe the Colonel's secret was not the affair itself. It was the means by which he concealed it." Mrs. Netherby turned to him sharply. "What are you implying?" "That the bricked passage contained not just the chest, but a gas pipe, rerouted to feed an unused furnace, perhaps during his renovations. A foolish experiment. When he died, no one remembered it existed, until time, decay, and your silence let it breathe again." She blinked, lips trembling. "You think I knew that?" "I think you suspected something," said Purbright, "and that you found it easier to believe in ghosts than in guilt." Clara sat down slowly, as though her anger had drained into weariness. "You should have told me, Aunt. I could have helped." Mrs. Netherby gave a small, hopeless laugh. Helped? By telling the town that your uncle was an adulterer and I a fool? Better they whisper about spirits. Spirits are easier to forgive. Then why hide the letters again? Purbright asked gently. She looked at him then, and her composure finally cracked. Because I read them, she whispered, every word. And I realized he hadn't loved her either. He loved no one enough to face the truth. Her voice faltered. I wanted to burn them. I tried. But something in me couldn't. I thought if they stayed behind the wall, they'd stay dead. Purbright inclined his head. Walls, Mrs. Netherby, are poor graveyards. They keep the dust, but never the peace. The room fell quiet again. Outside, a bird sang briefly and was promptly ignored. Clara turned to Elsie. You knew something too, didn't you? Elsie looked stricken. Only that the noise weren't ghosts, miss. I could smell it. The gas. I told you, but Clara nodded. And you were right. I'm sorry, Elsie. Mrs. Netherby, to everyone's surprise, said softly, So am I. Purbright rose, placing his hat on. I shall record this as an accidental structural hazard, repaired and resolved. The papers will not appear in any official record. Mrs. Netherby looked up. You mean you'll spare me? I mean, said Purbright, that I dislike paperwork almost as much as scandal. He moved to the door, paused, then added with his characteristic dryness. There is only one small matter that still troubles me. Mrs. Netherby's head lifted. Yes. Purbright turned back, his tone deceptively polite. Who, may I ask, repaired the portrait wire? Clara frowned. The portrait? Yes, the first time it tilted, the day the haunting began. Someone had taken it down and rehung it slightly higher. Mrs. Netherby looked puzzled. Not I, Elsie shook her head. Nor me, sir. Purbright's gaze settled on Clara. She flushed. I adjusted it. The frame was crooked. Before or after the first noise? She hesitated. Before. Purbright's voice was almost gentle. Ah, then the noise wasn't what startled the picture. It was the movement of air from the vent, released when you shifted the hook. You set the haunting in motion, Miss Liddon. Clara's face drained of colour. I didn't mean to. Of course not, Purbright said kindly. But you see, even the smallest actions, the tidy gestures, can disturb what others have so carefully sealed. He looked toward Mrs. Netherby. And sometimes that's precisely what's needed. As he left, the house seemed curiously still. The walls, freshly patched, made no sound at all. Outside, Purbright paused on the step. Love was waiting by the gate, notebook in hand. All settled, sir? Yes, Sergeant. The ghosts have gone back to being plumbing. Right? And the family? Also plumbing, said Purbright dryly. Leaky in parts, but repairable. Love frowned. So that's it then. Purbright looked back at the house, faintly smiling. Not quite. There's one more thing I must do. That evening, he returned quietly to the churchyard, carrying a small envelope. He placed it beneath Alice Wilton's brass plaque, one of the letters folded and sealed. Then he straightened his hat and murmured, Everyone deserves one honest breath. He walked away, leaving the church to its silence. The morning after his visit to the vicarage and his quiet question, Inspector Pubright arrived at Beaconsfield Avenue not as a detective, but as a guest. At least, that was how the butler Jenkins announced him. Mrs. Netherby will see you in the library, sir. She said you'd know why. Purbright did. He entered to find the widow already seated at her husband's old desk, a small brass key, the same one from the fireplace, lying between her hands. The curtains were half drawn, the light filtered and uncertain, as though the house itself wasn't sure whether the truth counted as morning or dusk. "You said yesterday," she began quietly, "that walls are poor graveyards. I believe you were right." Purbright inclined his head. "That is kind of you to admit, though it deprives me of my only memorable remark this week." She gave a brittle laugh. "I've decided to have the wall opened properly. The one behind the study hearth. Jenkins and the builder are ready. You may witness if you wish." "Of course," said Purbright, "though I suspect it's not masonry you truly mean to open." She met his gaze for a long moment before looking away. "You're perceptive, Inspector. That must make life rather lonely." He smiled faintly. "It has its advantages. One learns when not to interrupt." They descended to the study where Mr. Lorimer the builder, punctual, taciturn, and already covered in respectable dust, was preparing his tools. Clara stood by the door, pale but resolute, and Elsie waited nervously beside a covered sheet laid across the floor. Mrs. Netherby gave a curt nod. "Begin." The first chisel struck with a hollow, echoing tone. Plaster fell away in small, polite flakes. Lorimer worked methodically, pausing only to mutter about the Colonel's curious taste in mortar. After a few minutes a cavity appeared, small, square, and unmistakably deliberate. From within came a faint smell of dust and oil, and something else: age, secrecy, regret. "Careful now," Purbright murmured. Lorimer reached in and withdrew a second smaller box, tin this time, unadorned, and far more modest than the ornate chest discovered earlier. He placed it on the desk and stepped back. "That's all there was, sir." Mrs. Netherby regarded it with tight composure. "I'd no idea there was another." Purbright examined the lid. It bore no lock, only a label in the Colonel's writing. "To be opened only in presence of my wife and Inspector Pubright, should the need arise." He glanced up, a flicker of dry amusement in his eyes. "I do appreciate the Colonel's confidence in my longevity." "Open
"It," said Mrs. Netherby. He did, gently, as though lifting the lid on a confession. Inside were a few brittle sheets of paper, a faded photograph, and one small envelope marked, "For Agatha." Purbright handed the envelope to Mrs. Netherby. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The letter inside was short. She read it once, then twice, and said nothing. Finally, she handed it to him. "You may read it. I've no wish to keep it secret any longer." He nodded and read aloud softly. "My dear Agatha, I could not tell you while I lived what I have now learned to regret in dying. Alice is dead, and I am to blame, not by hand, but by silence. I let her despair without comfort, because I lacked courage to face you. If you ever read this, know that I loved you more for your pride than for your kindness. That was my failing. I have left her letters hidden. Burn them if you can forgive me, or keep them if you cannot. Your husband, Edgar." Silence filled the room like water. Mrs. Netherby did not weep. She simply folded her hands and stared at the box. "He always preferred the final word," she said at last. "Even from beyond his grave." Purbright closed the lid gently. "He left you a choice at least." She looked up sharply. "A choice between forgiveness and memory. Both equally impossible." Clara stepped forward then, hesitantly. "Aunt, perhaps this is the moment to let it go, to stop carrying what isn't yours." Mrs. Netherby's voice softened. "You think I carry his guilt?" "Yes," Clara said. "And your own. You've lived so long trying not to be pitied that you've forgotten how to be free." The words hung in the air. Even Elsie, pretending to polish the skirting, froze. Mrs. Netherby said nothing for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she whispered, "Freedom is not something respectable people are trained to endure." Purbright inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect more than sympathy. And yet occasionally it insists. He turned to Lorimer. You may reseal the wall, Mr. Lorimer, but I believe a small cavity. Air this time, not secrets. The builder nodded, faintly smiling. Aye, sir. Every house breathes better for a bit of truth. An hour later, Purbright sat again in the Netherby library, writing a brief report, the only one he intended to file. Investigation concluded, no crime, historical domestic concealment, emotional rather than criminal cause, structural faults remedied. He placed it neatly in an envelope. Clara entered quietly behind him. She's gone to rest, she said. I think she's quieter. Good, said Purbright. So is the house. Clara hesitated. Will you tell the papers the truth? He smiled faintly. I shall tell them there was no ghost. They will not believe me, which will make them happy. That seems fair. She smiled. A fragile thing. And what will happen to the letters? They will stay where they belong, he said, slipping the tin box into her hands, with the person most likely to understand their weight. She looked startled. You mean me? You, said Purbright, because forgiveness is lighter to carry when one isn't the injured party. That evening he returned once more to the vicarage, where the Reverend Chalmers was pruning his roses in defiance of the calendar. Our inspector, the vicar said, peace restored? As much as Flaxborough ever allows. And Mrs. Netherby? She's resting, perhaps dreaming of redecorating in something less metaphorical. The vicar smiled sadly. And the colonel? Purbright glanced toward the churchyard. Still bricked up, one hopes, in whatever afterlife tolerates old fools. They shared a companionable silence. Then Purbright said, almost to himself, Funny thing, Reverend, how small the causes of great tragedies often are. One mislaid key, one unsaid word, one turned photograph. The vicar nodded. That's sin for you, utterly domestic. Purbright chuckled. Quite. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to return to the station. There's a bicycle missing from the rectory yard again. A more comprehensible crime, at least. That night, Beaconsfield Avenue lay utterly still. The portrait of the colonel hung straight at last. No breathing came from the walls, no tapping from the vents. In her room, Mrs. Netherby sat by the window holding the letter. After a long time, she struck a match and lit the edge of the page. The flame crept slowly upward, soft and gold, until only ash remained. And for the first time in years, the room smelled not of dust, but of warmth. At the same hour, in his small office above the police station, Purbright finished his paperwork, extinguished his pipe, and murmured to the empty air, Well, that's one house exorcised. Tomorrow, perhaps, the council meeting, a far less forgivable haunt. He smiled, closed the file, and switched off the lamp. Flaxborough's appetite for mystery had a short shelf life. By the time the weekend market returned, the haunted house affair was already softening into anecdote, like scones left too long under glass. The Chronicle published a final notice. No further manifestations at Beaconsfield Avenue. Police praise public calm. The townsfolk, relieved but slightly disappointed, turned their minds back to potholes, choir practice, and the upcoming flower show. Inspector Pubright, however, believed every story deserved one final courtesy, an explanation. Not for the sake of justice, and there was none to distribute, but for the sake of accuracy, which in Flaxborough was a rare form of compassion. He arrived at the Netherby house on a pale Sunday afternoon. Mrs. Netherby awaited him in the parlour, dressed with the deliberation of someone who meant to control at least one conversation that week. Clara was present too, quiet but steadier than before.
The portrait of the colonel hung perfectly straight, its expression resigned to whatever truths might be spoken beneath it. "Inspector," Mrs. Netherby began, "you've been extraordinarily patient. I think we all deserve to know how you intend to describe these events, officially." Purbright bowed slightly. "Officially, madam, the case is closed. The noises were the result of structural faults, a disused vent connected to a corroded gas line. The so-called haunting was therefore an unfortunate combination of acoustics and imagination." Mrs. Netherby gave a dry smile. "Acoustics and imagination? How mercifully scientific." Clara looked up. "And the letters?" "They've been returned to the family," Purbright said, "as private property. No law compels their preservation or their destruction." Mrs. Netherby studied him, measuring the distance between what he knew and what he would say. "That, I take it, is the public version." Purbright inclined his head. "Public versions are often the kindest. Truth, when unadorned, can be socially awkward." He placed his hat on his knee, his tone lightening. "Still, since we are among friends, perhaps you'll indulge my unofficial explanation. It won't appear in any report, but it may assist in sleeping soundly." Clara nodded. Her aunt said nothing, which in Flaxborough was permission enough. Purbright folded his hands. "The colonel, as we now know, constructed 2 walls, one of brick and one of pride. Behind the first, he concealed his papers. Behind the second, he concealed remorse. In time, both decayed. When the gas escaped, the family heard its breath and mistook it for his, perfectly natural." He paused, watching the widow's face. "The rest, the fear, the gossip, the haunting, was the town's contribution. Flaxborough is remarkably democratic that way." Mrs. Netherby gave a small, genuine laugh. "You make it sound almost innocent." "Innocence," said Purbright, "is usually just ignorance with good manners." He rose, glancing once more around the room. "I must thank you for your hospitality through all this unpleasantness. Your house, Mrs. Netherby, is quite sound now, in every sense." She followed his gaze to the repaired wall. "And yet, Inspector, I sometimes think it's emptier for being whole." "That," Purbright said softly, "is the usual price of peace." He turned to Clara. "Look after her, Miss Liddon. She's spent many years holding her breath." "I will," Clara said. Outside, Sergeant Love was waiting by the car, polishing the windscreen with more enthusiasm than skill. "All tidy, sir?" "As tidy as life allows." "So what really happened, if I might ask?" Purbright lit his pipe. "A mixture of plumbing, cowardice, and sentiment. The usual domestic trinity." Love grinned. "And no one to charge?" "Only the human condition, Sergeant. Unfortunately, we're
still negotiating extradition." They climbed into the car. As they pulled away, Purbright glanced back at the house, its windows calm, its curtains still. For the first time in months, Beaconsfield Avenue looked content to mind its own business. That evening, the inspector attended the vicar's service, partly from duty, partly from curiosity, about how repentance sounded when professionally delivered. The sermon was on forgiveness and forgetting. Purbright, seated discreetly near the back, thought it admirably concise. 10 minutes, no gesturing, no optimism. Afterwards, Reverend Chalmers joined him by the lich gate. "So, Inspector, absolution all round?" "More or less," Purbright said. "The widow has burnt her relics, the niece will inherit the peace, the rest of the town has found a new scandal. Apparently someone's been overwatering the dahlias at the rectory." The vicar smiled. "Then the moral order of Flaxborough is restored." "For now," said Purbright. Later, back at the station, he dictated his final note for the file. Case: Netherby residence. Breathing walls. Findings: natural causes exacerbated by secrecy. Recommendation? None. Human nature requires no reform, merely ventilation. He read it over, then added one last line. Inspector Pubright respectfully concludes that truth, when delivered politely, seldom offends for long. He set down his pen, removed his spectacles, and regarded the cooling world outside his window, roofs, chimneys, small ambitions all exhaling into evening. At Beaconsfield Avenue, a gentler peace had indeed settled. Clara and Elsie cleared the last of the tea things while Mrs. Netherby sat by the fire, watching the flames with the expression of someone slowly remembering how to be alive. When the clock struck 9, she said quietly, "Clara, open the window a little. The air feels close." The younger woman did so. A soft breeze stirred the curtains, carrying away the faint scent of old smoke and newly mended plaster. "Better?" Clara asked. "Yes," said Mrs. Netherby. "I think the house is breathing again. Properly this time." Far across the town, Purbright walked home beneath the gas lamps. The streets were quiet, save for the familiar rattle of a milk cart and the distant laughter from the Crown and Mitre. He reflected, as he often did after closing a case, that the dead rarely troubled him half as much as the living. The former, at least, had the decency to keep still. He reached his door, turned the key, and paused before entering. Somewhere nearby, a cat yowled, a church clock chimed, and a soft wind passed through the alley. All perfectly ordinary sounds, yet woven together they made something almost like a sigh. Purbright smiled faintly. "Not tonight," he murmured. "We're all breathed out." He went inside, hung up his hat, and switched off the light.